The record opens with an unqualified declaration. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Yet immediately, the text presents a condition that invites scrutiny. The earth described as tohu wa-bohu, formless and void, submerged beneath waters and wrapped in darkness. For centuries, scholars and mystics have posed a quiet question. If the Creator is perfect, why does the account begin with disorder? Some traditions propose that Genesis 1:2 does not describe the first moment of creation, but a later state, a remnant of something that came before. Others, drawing from mystical frameworks, suggest that the world familiar to Adam was not the first, but merely one phase in a concealed progression of cosmic cycles. This documentary examines those traditions, the textual puzzles they address, and the forgotten cosmologies that imagine creation not as a singular event, but as a rhythm of emergence, collapse, and renewal. The first words of Genesis carry a weight that has shaped theological thought for millennia. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The declaration is absolute, framed in Hebrew with the verb bara, a term reserved exclusively for divine activity, never applied to human effort. It signals origination, the bringing into existence of something that had no prior form. Yet the very next verse interrupts the clarity with a description that has troubled readers since antiquity. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. The Hebrew phrase tohu wa-bohu, rendered formless and void, appears nowhere else in Scripture except in contexts of ruin and judgment. Isaiah 34:11 uses the phrase to describe the desolation of Edom under divine wrath. Jeremiah 4:23 employs it to depict the land of Judah laid waste, returned to a state of chaos as punishment for rebellion. The pairing of these two verses, one announcing perfect creation, the other presenting disorder, has led some interpreters to propose that they do not describe the same moment. The question centers on whether Genesis 1:2 depicts the initial condition of creation or a subsequent state. If the Creator is perfect, the reasoning follows: why would the work of his hands begin in formlessness and darkness? Some early commentators concluded that Genesis 1:1 describes an original, complete creation, unblemished and inhabited, while Genesis 1:2 introduces a later catastrophe that reduced that order to chaos. The interval between the two verses, they suggested, could encompass an unspecified duration, years, centuries, or eons during which the pristine beginning was undone. This interpretive framework, often termed the gap theory or ruin reconstruction hypothesis, rests on the premise that the 6 days of Genesis do not represent first creation, but restoration, the reforming of a world that had fallen into ruin. Central to this reading is the examination of Hebrew vocabulary. Alongside bara, which denotes creation, Genesis 1 employs a second verb, asah, typically translated as to make or to fashion. Advocates of the gap theory have sometimes argued that bara refers exclusively to creation from nothing, while asah describes the forming of something from pre-existing material. Under this distinction, the 6 days would involve asah, God making, shaping, and ordering what already existed in chaotic form, rather than calling it into being for the first time. The sun, moon, and stars, for instance, are said to have been made, asah, on the 4th day, leading some to propose that they were not originally created then, but were reconstituted or made visible after a period of obscuration. Yet this linguistic argument has faced scrutiny. The two verbs are used interchangeably throughout Genesis and the wider biblical text. Genesis 1:27 states that God created bara humanity, while Genesis 5:1 says he made asah them, referring to the same event. Isaiah 45:18 uses both terms in parallel. He created it, he formed it, he established it. He created it not in vain tohu, he formed it to be inhabited. The overlap suggests that the verbs function as synonyms in many contexts, differing primarily in stylistic nuance rather than theological substance. Nonetheless, the phrase tohu wa-bohu remains a focal point. The term tohu appears 20 times in the Hebrew scriptures, often carrying connotations of emptiness, futility, or wasteland. Bohu, far rarer, occurs only 3 times, always paired with tohu, and in each instance outside Genesis, it describes conditions brought about by divine judgment. The coupling suggests not a neutral state of unformed potential, but a condition of active disorder, as though something once structured had been reduced to chaos. This has led interpreters to ask whether the earth was formless or became formless, a question hinging on the Hebrew verb haya, which can be rendered either way depending on context. If the earth became formless, the implication is that it had a prior state, one of order and completeness, before descending into the void described in verse 2. The gap theory, then, is not a modern invention, but a recurring response to perceived tension within the opening verses of Genesis. It proposes that verse 1 describes an original, dateless creation, while verse 2 presents the aftermath of an intervening catastrophe. The 6 days that follow would constitute not the first fashioning of the cosmos, but its renovation, light restored, waters divided anew, land re-emerged from beneath the deep, and life repopulated across sky, sea, and soil. The theory does not demand that this interval be brief. Some proponents have suggested it lasted long enough to accommodate geological ages, fossil records, and the evidence of mass extinctions that appear to predate human history. Others have focused less on geology and more on spiritual history, linking the ruin of verse 2 to events in the angelic realm, rebellion, judgment, and the expulsion of fallen beings from their original stations. What remains undisputed is that the text itself offers no explicit account of what, if anything, transpired between the 2 verses. There is no narrative of catastrophe, no description of how order became disorder, no mention of inhabitants who may have lived and perished in the interval. The gap, if it exists, is a silence, one filled not by the record, but by interpretive tradition attempting to reconcile the juxtaposition of a perfect creator with a chaotic starting point. The interpretive history of this gap extends across centuries and traditions. Early Jewish commentators, including some of the rabbis whose work appears in the Midrash, speculated about pre-Adamic worlds, creations that preceded the present order and were dissolved before humanity appeared. While these musings were often framed as theological exercises rather than literal history, they reflect an awareness that the opening of Genesis permits multiple readings. Christian scholars of the 17th and 19th centuries, confronted with emerging geological discoveries, revisited the gap theory as a means of reconciling scripture with evidence of ancient earth formations. Thomas Chalmers, a Scottish theologian of the early 1800s, popularized the view that a vast expanse of time separated Genesis 1 from 1-2, during which pre-Adamic life flourished and was subsequently destroyed. His formulation allowed for an old earth without requiring a symbolic reading of the 6 days, which he maintained were literal 24-hour periods. The gap theory found further expression in the Scofield Reference Bible, published in 1909, which included marginal notes suggesting the possibility of a ruined creation between verses 1 and 2. This edition circulated widely among English-speaking Protestant communities, embedding the gap hypothesis into popular theological consciousness. Yet the theory has also faced sustained criticism from those who argue that it imposes speculative content onto a text that does not demand it. Critics contend that reading Genesis 1-2 as a judgment scene requires importing concepts from other parts of Scripture, such as the fall of Satan or divine wrath against prior beings, that are never explicitly linked to the creation account. They note that the structure of Genesis 1 follows a pattern common in ancient cosmogonies, beginning with primordial chaos, then imposing order through successive acts of separation and formation. On this view, tohu wa-bohu represents not ruin but raw material, the unformed substrate from which the Creator fashions the cosmos. The phrase, without form and void, has also been examined in light of ancient Near Eastern creation myths, many of which begin with watery chaos and darkness before divine action introduces structure. Comparative studies have suggested that the biblical author may have been engaging with familiar motifs, deliberately contrasting the Genesis account, where creation proceeds by divine word alone, without conflict or struggle, with Babylonian and Canaanite narratives in which gods battle primordial monsters to establish order. In this literary context, tohu wa-bohu might function as a symbolic counterpoint to the completed creation, emphasizing the transformation wrought by divine speech rather than implying a prior catastrophe. Yet this comparative approach does not eliminate the textual peculiarity. Other ancient accounts describe chaos as the default state, whereas Genesis 1 presents a completed act before chaos is mentioned. Another element that gap theorists highlight is the absence of the phrase, "It was good" on the second day, when the waters are divided. While the omission may be stylistic or structural, some interpreters have taken it as a subtle indication that the waters themselves are problematic, remnants of judgment that resist complete integration into the new order. This reading treats water as a symbol of chaos throughout Genesis, from the deep of 1-2 to the flood that later submerges the earth in response to human wickedness. If the flood represents a return to pre-creation conditions, the reasoning goes, then the original state of Genesis 1-2 may also reflect divine judgment, with the floodwaters of Noah's time echoing the dark waters that covered the formless earth. The question of light further complicates the narrative. On the first day, God commands, "Let there be light," and light appears. Yet the sun, moon, and stars are not created until the fourth day. Gap theorists have proposed that the initial light was a restoration. Light that had existed in the original creation of verse 1 was extinguished during the intervening catastrophe and was now being renewed. This would explain why light exists independently of the luminaries. It is not solar light, but a prior illumination, perhaps associated with the presence of the Creator himself. The luminaries of day 4, then, would serve to govern and regulate the light already present, rather than to generate it for the first time. Opponents of the gap theory counter that the text makes no such distinction, and that treating the first light as a separate category introduces complexity the narrative does not require. Despite these debates, the gap theory has endured because it addresses a persistent intuition, the feeling that Genesis 1-2 describes something more than a neutral starting point. The darkness, the deep, the formless void, all carry weight, a sense of absence or loss that the stark declaration of verse 1 does not prepare the reader to expect. Whether this intuition reflects a real feature of the text or a projection shaped by later theological concerns remains contested. What is certain is that the gap, if it exists, is never narrated. The record moves from the completed act of creation to the formless earth without explanation, leaving interpreters to fill the silence with conjecture, tradition, and the fragments of other biblical passages that seem, however distantly, to echo the theme of prior judgment and restoration. By the close of the first chapter's examination, the textual foundation is established. 2 verses stand in unresolved tension. Between them lies either nothing, a simple transition from declaration to description, or an uncharted interval during which the original order was undone. The 6 days that follow may represent first creation, or they may represent renewal. The record does not settle the question. It offers only the words themselves, their arrangement, and the space between them, a space that has invited speculation for as long as the text has been read. If the formless void of Genesis 1:2 represents not an initial condition but a later state, the question inevitably arises: what existed before the ruin? The hypothesis that an interval separates the two verses invites speculation about inhabitants, beings who may have occupied the pristine earth described in Genesis 1:1 and whose presence, or absence, explains the desolation that follows. The biblical text offers no explicit account of such a population, yet certain passages have been read as cryptic references to a pre-Adamic order, fragments that suggest life existed before the familiar genealogy began. One of the most enigmatic of these passages appears in Proverbs 8, where wisdom is personified and speaks of her own origins. "The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old," wisdom declares. She continues, "Ages ago I was set up at the first before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water." The passage describes wisdom as present during the acts of creation, observing the establishment of the heavens, the drawing of the circle upon the face of the deep, and the setting of boundaries for the sea. Then comes the verse that has drawn particular attention: "Rejoicing in his inhabited world, and my delight was with the sons of men." The phrase "sons of men" appears after wisdom describes the completion of foundational structures: the heavens, the clouds, the fountains of the deep, the limits of the sea, but before the narrative of Genesis introduces Adam. Some interpreters have taken this passage as evidence that human-like beings existed in the original creation, before the mountains were settled and before the earth as we know it took its present form. Wisdom delights in the sons of men at a stage described as prior to the laying of the earth's foundations, raising the question of who these figures are. The text does not name them. It does not explain their nature, their fate, or their relationship to the Adamic line. It presents them as objects of wisdom's delight within an inhabited world, a phrase that suggests occupation and presence, not emptiness. If this inhabited world predates Adam, it would align with the notion that Genesis 1:1 describes a complete, populated creation, and that the formless void of verse 2 represents the aftermath of that world's undoing. A second passage often cited in this context is Isaiah 45:18, which addresses the purpose of creation directly. "For thus says the Lord who created the heavens, he is God, who formed the earth and made it. He established it, he created it not in vain, he formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no other." The Hebrew word translated in vain is tohu, the same term used in Genesis 1:2 to describe the formless earth. Isaiah's declaration is unambiguous. The Creator did not fashion the earth as tohu, as a wasteland or void. He formed it with intention, designing it to be inhabited. The verse presents a theological claim about divine purpose, but it also introduces a textual problem. If God did not create the earth tohu, why does Genesis 1:2 describe it precisely as tohu wa-bohu, formless and void? Gap theorists have proposed that Isaiah 45:18 reflects the original creation, the work described in Genesis 1:1, while Genesis 1:2 describes a subsequent condition imposed by judgment. On this reading, the earth was initially formed to be inhabited, populated, ordered, and complete, but became formless as a result of catastrophe. The tohu of Genesis 1:2 would not represent the Creator's intent, but a deviation from it, a state that necessitated the restorative work of the 6 days. The verse in Isaiah, then, serves as a counter-testimony to the chaos of Genesis 1:2, affirming that the wasteland was never the plan, and implying that something intervened to disrupt the original design. The question of who inhabited the earth in its first state has generated various proposals. Some have suggested an angelic presence, beings created before humanity to dwell upon the earth and serve as its stewards. Others have posited a pre-Adamic race of humans, distinct from the lineage of Adam but nevertheless made in the image of God, living and possibly flourishing before the catastrophe that reduced the world to formlessness. This hypothesis was articulated most famously by Isaac Laperer in the 17th century, who argued that Genesis describes two creations. First, the creation of the Gentiles, then the creation of Adam as the father of the Hebrew people. Laperer cited the narrative of Cain, who after murdering Abel expresses fear of being killed by others, and goes on to marry a woman whose origin is never explained. Cain also builds a city, an act that implies the existence of a population beyond his immediate family. Laperer interpreted these details as evidence that other people existed alongside the Adamic line, descendants of the pre-Adamic creation. While Laperer's framework was controversial and ultimately condemned by religious authorities of his time, it reflects a persistent interpretive impulse. The attempt to account for textual details that seem to exceed the boundaries of the Genesis narrative. The existence of Cain's wife, the fear of vengeful strangers, the founding of a city all suggest a broader human context than the text explicitly provides. Gap theorists have sometimes incorporated these elements, proposing that the pre-Adamic inhabitants survived the catastrophe in some diminished form, or that their descendants persisted in the post-restoration world, existing parallel to the line of Adam. The notion of a pre-Adamic population has also been connected to the enigmatic Nephilim, mentioned briefly in Genesis 6:4. The passage states that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. The phrase, and also afterward, has been interpreted by some to mean that the Nephilim existed both before and after the flood, raising the question of their origin. If they were present in those days, the antediluvian period, some have speculated that their lineage extends further back still, to time before Adam, when the earth was inhabited by beings who predated the familiar human genealogy. The text does not support this reading explicitly, but the ambiguity of the Nephilim's origin has made them a focal point for theories about pre-Adamic life. Another line of inquiry examines the role of the sons of God mentioned in Genesis 6, often interpreted as angelic beings who took human wives. If angels were present and active on earth during the days of Noah, the reasoning follows they must have existed long before, perhaps from the time of the original creation described in Genesis 1:1. Job 38:4-7 lends weight to this view, as it records the Creator asking Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." The passage indicates that angelic beings witnessed the earth's foundation, suggesting they were created prior to it or at its inception. If they were present at the beginning, they may have inhabited the pristine earth, serving roles that the text no longer describes. Their existence would predate humanity, and if the earth was formed to be inhabited, as Isaiah 45:18 declares, the angels may have been its first residents. Yet the gap theory does not require that the pre-Adamic inhabitants were angelic. Some interpreters have proposed that the original earth was populated by humans distinct from Adam, created in an earlier phase and governed by laws or conditions different from those that followed the restoration. This would explain why Adam is called the first man in 1 Corinthians 15:45, yet is introduced in Genesis as though the narrative assumes a larger context. The text does not say Adam was the first living creature, nor even the first intelligent being, only that he was formed from the dust of the ground and placed in the Garden of Eden. If the garden represents a specific location within a larger world, it is possible that other regions existed beyond its boundaries, regions inhabited by beings whose origin the Genesis account does not address. The fate of these hypothetical inhabitants is never narrated. If they existed, the record is silent on what became of them. Gap theorists who link the formlessness of Genesis 1-2 to divine judgment have sometimes proposed that the pre-Adamic population was destroyed in the catastrophe that reduced the earth to chaos. The darkness, the covering waters, the absence of life, all would represent the aftermath of their removal. Whether they perished in judgment or were dissolved along with the order they inhabited, the result is the same: the void. The six-day restoration would then constitute not the first peopling of the earth, but its second, with Adam serving as the progenitor of a new line established after the prior one was erased. Isaiah's insistence that the earth was not created tohu has also been read as a theological protest against dualistic cosmologies that treat chaos as eternal or co-equal with the divine. By affirming that the formless void was not the Creator's intent, the verse distinguishes the biblical account from mythologies in which darkness and disorder are primordial, resisting but never fully subdued by divine order. In Genesis, chaos is not eternal. It is a condition imposed at a particular moment, and it is entirely subject to the will of the Creator, who commands light into being and separates the waters by word alone. If the tohu of Genesis 1:2 is a later state rather than an original one, it reinforces the sovereignty of the Creator. Even ruin is under His governance, permitted for purposes the text does not explain but ultimately subject to renewal. The mystery of the sons of men in Proverbs 8 has also been interpreted in non-literal ways. Some commentators argue that the phrase refers not to actual pre-Adamic beings, but to humanity as it would later exist, seen in the foresight of divine wisdom. On this reading, wisdom delights in the sons of men proleptically, anticipating their creation and existence even before they are formed. This interpretation preserves the uniqueness of Adam as the first human and avoids the speculative difficulties introduced by positing a prior race. Yet it requires reading the passage as a poetic compression of time, in which future events are spoken of as though already present, a technique not uncommon in biblical prophecy, but less typical in wisdom literature. What remains consistent across these interpretations is the sense that the opening chapters of Genesis contain more than they reveal. The text gestures toward a larger context, an inhabited world, a purposeful creation, a condition of order that precedes the chaos of verse 2, but it does not narrate that context. The reader is left with fragments, wisdom's delight in unnamed figures, Isaiah's declaration that formlessness was never intended, the presence of angelic witnesses at the earth's foundation, the enigmatic Nephilim who exist both before and after the flood. These fragments do not form a coherent narrative on their own. They must be assembled, interpreted, and connected by readers willing to ask what lies beneath the surface of the canonical account. By the close of this chapter, the question of inhabitants remains unresolved. If the earth became formless, something or someone may have occupied it before the ruin. The record offers hints but no confirmation. It speaks of an inhabited world, of a creation formed with purpose, of beings who witnessed the foundations being laid. Whether these references point to a literal pre-Adamic population or serve other literary and theological functions, the text does not say. What is certain is that the darkness of Genesis 1:2 is described as covering a world that, according to Isaiah, was never meant to be void. The gap, if it exists, swallowed whatever came before, leaving only silence and the formless deep. The question of how the earth became formless has led many interpreters beyond the text of Genesis itself, to passages that seem to describe events in the spiritual realm, events that may have preceded the familiar narrative and provided a mechanism for the ruin of the original creation. Chief among these is the tradition that links the chaos of Genesis 1:2 to the rebellion of a high-ranking angel, a figure later identified with Satan. This interpretive framework proposes that the darkness and void are not arbitrary conditions, but the consequences of judgment imposed in response to insurrection, a cosmic conflict that unfolded in the interval between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, before the 6 days began. 2 prophetic texts have been central to this tradition, Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. Both are formally addressed to earthly rulers, the king of Tyre and the king of Babylon, respectively, but both contain language that appears to exceed human limitations, describing figures whose origins, splendor, and downfall seem to transcend mortal scope. Ezekiel 28 opens with a lament against the prince of Tyre, condemning his pride and claiming divinity. But beginning in verse 12, the tone shifts. The prophet is instructed to take up a lament against the king of Tyre, and the language becomes more exalted. You were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. The passage lists gemstones: sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, carbuncle, and declares that the workmanship of settings and engravings was prepared on the day of the being's creation. Text continues, You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. The term anointed cherub designates a position of extraordinary authority, a role associated with proximity to the divine throne. Cherubim appear elsewhere in Scripture as guardians of sacred space, stationed at the entrance to Eden after the expulsion of Adam and Eve, and represented in gold atop the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle. To be called an anointed cherub is to occupy a station of honor and responsibility, entrusted with guardianship in the presence of God Himself. The phrase stones of fire has been interpreted variously as symbols of divine holiness, as elements associated with God's throne, or as literal features of a heavenly realm where the cherub walked in perfection. Yet the lament does not end with honor. Verse 15 introduces a turning point. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, till unrighteousness was found in you. The text describes a fall from perfection, a shift from blameless service to the intrusion of iniquity. The cause is identified in verse 17. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. Pride becomes the catalyst for downfall, and the consequence is expulsion. I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. The language of casting down, of removal from the holy mountain, parallels the imagery of judgment found in other prophetic texts, and has led readers to see in this passage not merely the condemnation of a human king, but a deeper narrative, the fall of an angelic being whose rebellion preceded human history. Isaiah 14 offers a similar pattern. The chapter begins with a taunt against the king of Babylon, celebrating his downfall and the cessation of his oppression. But in verse 12, the rhetoric intensifies. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. The term day star, rendered in the Latin Vulgate as Lucifer, meaning light bearer, has been understood by many Christian interpreters as a proper name for the angel who fell, though the Hebrew text uses the phrase Helol ben Shachar, which simply means shining one, son of the morning. The passage describes an ambition that reaches beyond earthly kingship. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. The 5 I will statements depict a systematic attempt to usurp divine authority, to elevate the self to the position of the Creator. The result is catastrophe, but you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. The descent is total, a reversal of the attempted ascent. Those who see the fallen figure are astonished. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities? The language of making the earth tremble and turning the world into a desert resonates with the formless void of Genesis 1:2, suggesting to some interpreters a direct connection between the fall described in Isaiah and the ruin that necessitated the six-day restoration. The question of timing is critical. If the rebellion of this high angel occurred during the interval between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, it would provide an explanation for the transformation of the earth from a completed, inhabited creation into a formless, dark wasteland. Gap theorists have proposed that the expulsion of the cherub from the mountain of God and the casting down of the day star from heaven were events that took place in the pre-Adamic period, and that the earth itself became a theater of judgment, shrouded in darkness, submerged beneath chaotic waters, stripped of the order it once possessed. The spiritual rebellion would have physical consequences, disrupting the created order and necessitating divine intervention to restore it. The framework that links angelic rebellion to the ruin of Genesis 1:2 does not rest on these two passages alone. Revelation 12 describes a war in heaven. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. The passage situates this conflict in eschatological context, as part of the events surrounding the birth of the Messiah and the final judgment. Yet the phrase, that ancient serpent, suggests a figure whose origin extends far back, beyond the scope of the immediate narrative. If Satan is the serpent of Eden, and if his presence in the garden implies prior rebellion, the question arises, when did that rebellion occur? Some traditions hold that the fall of Satan took place before the creation of humanity, providing the context for his appearance in Genesis 3 as an adversary already opposed to the divine plan. If he had already fallen by the time Adam was formed, his rebellion must have occurred either during the interval between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, or in a realm separate from the physical creation altogether. Gap theorists favor the former, arguing that the darkness imposed upon the earth in Genesis 1:2 is the direct result of Satan's expulsion from his position as guardian cherub. The earth, once his domain, becomes the site of his judgment, rendered formless and void as the light of divine presence is withdrawn. The notion that Satan was assigned to the earth in his original, unfallen state finds support in the Ezekiel passage, which places the anointed cherub in Eden, the garden of God. This Eden is not necessarily the same as the garden described in Genesis 2, where Adam and Eve are placed. Some interpreters distinguish between a pre-Adamic Eden, associated with the cherub's original dwelling, and the later Eden prepared for humanity after the restoration. The former would have been part of the pristine creation of Genesis 1:1, a realm of beauty and order where the cherub walked among the stones of fire. The latter would be a reconstituted garden, established within the restored creation of the 6 days. This reading allows for two Edens, separated by the catastrophe of rebellion and the subsequent renewal. The connection between pride and cosmic ruin has theological significance beyond the mechanics of the gap theory. If the fall of the anointed cherub was driven by self-exaltation, the desire to be like the Most High, it establishes a pattern that recurs throughout Scripture. The serpent's temptation of Eve in Genesis 3 echoes this theme. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. The same ambition that led to the cherub's downfall is offered to humanity as a lure. If the earth's formlessness in Genesis 1:2 resulted from angelic pride, the introduction of sin into the human sphere through the same motive suggests a continuity of rebellion, an ongoing conflict that spans from the pre-Adamic interval through the present age. Yet the interpretation of Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 as references to Satan's fall is not without controversy. Critics argue that the passages are directed at historical kings and should be understood within their political and prophetic contexts. The king of Tyre was known for his pride and commercial power, the king of Babylon for his conquests and hubris. The language of the laments, while hyperbolic, may serve a rhetorical function, comparing earthly rulers to mythic figures of overreach and downfall without implying a literal angelic backstory. The phrase, "you were in Eden," could be metaphorical, suggesting a state of privilege and abundance rather than a literal presence in a primordial garden. The stones of fire might symbolize wealth or divine favor rather than a celestial realm. Even among those who accept a connection between these passages and angelic rebellion, disagreement exists about the timing. Some propose that Satan's fall occurred after the creation of humanity, perhaps shortly before the events of Genesis 3, rather than in the interval between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. This view maintains that the 6 days describe original creation, not restoration, and that the darkness of verse 2 is a neutral starting point rather than a condition imposed by judgment. Satan's rebellion on this timeline would be a consequence of his resentment toward humanity, created in the image of God and granted dominion over the earth, an honor he coveted for himself. The gap theory, however, insists that the rebellion predates Adam, and that the formless earth is evidence of judgment already rendered. Darkness, in this framework, is not merely the absence of light but a sign of divine displeasure, a shroud cast over a world that had been stripped of its order. The restoration of light on the first day would then represent the lifting of judgment, the renewal of divine presence, and the beginning of a process to reclaim what had been lost. The 6 days become not the initial creation but a reclamation project, rebuilding on the ruins of a prior order. The theological appeal of this framework lies in its attempt to reconcile the goodness of God with the presence of evil and disorder. If the earth was created formless, the reasoning goes, it implies that God authored chaos. But if the formlessness is a consequence of judgment against rebellion, it preserves the doctrine that God's original works are perfect, and that disorder enters only through the actions of free agents who choose defiance. The gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 becomes a space where the origin of evil can be located, not in the Creator, but in the pride of a creature who sought to displace him. By the close of this chapter, the narrative of the fall that preceded Eden remains speculative but theologically potent. Ezekiel and Isaiah describe figures of extraordinary stature who fell from positions of honor through pride and ambition. Whether these passages refer to Satan, to earthly kings alone, or to a mythic archetype employed for rhetorical effect, the language has been used for centuries to explain the darkness of Genesis 1:2. The rebellion of the anointed cherub, if it occurred in the interval before the 6 days, would account for the transformation of the earth from order to chaos, and for the necessity of the restoration work that follows. The text does not confirm this reading, but neither does it foreclose it. The fall, like the gap itself, remains a possibility drawn from silence, inference, and the convergence of scattered passages that seem to gesture toward a conflict older than Eden. Beyond the frameworks of gap theory and angelic rebellion lies a more elaborate system of cosmological speculation, one rooted in Jewish mystical tradition and absent from the plain reading of Genesis. This is the doctrine of Shemitot, or cosmic sabbatical cycles, a teaching that reimagines the history of creation not as a single, unrepeated event, but as one phase within a vast pattern of emergence, dissolution, and renewal. According to this framework, the universe passes through 7 grand epochs, each lasting 7,000 years, and each corresponding to one of the lower Sefirot, the divine emanations that structure all reality. At the end of each cycle, the world returns to a state of primordial rest, only to be reconstituted in the next, governed by a different Sephirah and operating under different spiritual laws. The concept originates in the agricultural laws of the Torah, which command that the land of Israel be worked for 6 years and left fallow in the 7th, the Shemitah year. After 7 such cycles, 49 years, the 50th year is proclaimed a jubilee, a time of release and restoration. Rabbeinu Beche, a 13th century commentator, extended this pattern beyond the agricultural to the cosmic, proposing that just as the land observes sabbatical rest, so does the entire cosmos. He taught that history unfolds in increments of 7,000 years, 6 millennia of active civilization followed by a 7th millennium of desolation, a Sabbath of eternal rest corresponding to the world to come. This cycle repeats 7 times, producing a total span of 49,000 years, after which a cosmic jubilee occurs and the entire sequence begins anew. The mystical text Sefer HaTemunah, attributed to Kabbalistic circles of the 13th century, develops the doctrine further. It asserts that God creates worlds and then destroys them, citing a passage from the Midrash that hints at prior creations before the present order. Each of the 7 cycles, or Shemitot, is governed by one of the 7 lower Sefirot, divine attributes such as mercy, judgment, beauty, eternity, glory, foundation, and kingdom. These emanations structure the cosmos, determining the qualities and conditions under which life exists during each epoch. The world we inhabit, according to some Kabbalists, is not the first but the second, or possibly the 4th, Shemitah to support civilized life. Prior cycles existed, flourished for their allotted 6,000 years, and then dissolved into the formless rest that precedes renewal. The claim that our world is the 2nd or 4th cycle rests on interpretive readings of the Hebrew text itself, particularly the opening word of Genesis, Bereshit, in the beginning. The first letter of this word is Beit, whose numerical value is 2. Kabbalists note that the Beit in Bereshit is written larger than the other letters in traditional Torah scrolls, a scribal peculiarity that invites symbolic interpretation. The enlarged Beit, they suggest, signals that the creation described in Genesis is not the absolute first, but the second inhabited world. The letter also bears 4 ornamental crowns, small decorative projections called tajin, which some interpret as pointing to the 4th Shemitah overall, counting both the cycles that preceded ours and the one in which we now live. This reading transforms Genesis from an account of unique origin into a chapter within a much longer history. The formless void of Genesis 1-2, under this framework, is not the result of angelic rebellion or catastrophe, but the natural state between cosmic epochs, a period of dissolution that follows the completion of one Shemitah and precedes the activation of the next. The 6 days of creation would then represent not the first fashioning of the cosmos, but its reconstitution after a sabbatical rest of indeterminate duration. The world that emerged on those 6 days is built upon the remnants of prior cycles, shaped by the same divine principles, but configured according to the Sephirah governing the current epoch. The 7 Sefirot that govern the cycles are not arbitrary designations. In Kabbalistic cosmology, they represent the attributes through which the infinite and unknowable Ein Sof, the boundless divine essence, manifests in the finite realm. The first 3 Sefirot, crown, wisdom, and understanding, form the intellectual triad, representing the world as a manifestation of divine thought. The lower 7, beginning with mercy and extending through kingdom, govern the material and moral dimensions of existence, structuring time, space, and the dynamics of justice and compassion. Each Shemitah is dominated by one of these 7, meaning that the character of creation differs from cycle to cycle. A world governed by mercy would operate under principles of grace and forgiveness. One governed by judgment would emphasize law and consequence. Our current world, some suggest, is ruled by the Sephirah of beauty, which balances the extremes of the others. The duration of each cycle, 7,000 years, finds support in Talmudic passages that describe the age of the world in sabbatical terms. Tractate Sanhedrin 97 teaches that the world will endure for 6,000 years and lie desolate for 1,000, echoing the pattern of 6 days of labor followed by Sabbath rest. Rosh Hashanah 31 mentions a similar framework, though another opinion suggests that the final rest period may last 2,000 years, accounting for both the 7th millennium and the Jubilee. Rabbeinu Beche reconciles these views by proposing that after 49,000 years of civilization and 7 sabbatical millennia, the 50th millennium serves as the Great Jubilee, a period of cosmic release before the entire cycle restarts. The doctrine of Shemitot also addresses the question of why prior worlds were dissolved. According to Sefer HaTemunah, each cycle is an experiment in divine manifestation, a world brought into being under the governance of a particular Sephirah to explore the possibilities inherent in that attribute. A world governed entirely by mercy, for instance, might lack the structure and discipline necessary for moral development. One governed by judgment alone might be too harsh to sustain life. Each cycle, then, serves as a refinement, a step toward the ultimate balance that will be achieved in the final Shemitah. The dissolution of prior worlds is not judgment but completion, the natural conclusion of a phase that has fulfilled its purpose and given way to the next. This cosmology also offers an explanation for the existence of fossils, ancient geological formations, and evidence of life that appears to predate the biblical timeline. If multiple cycles have occurred, each lasting thousands of years and each supporting its own forms of existence, the remnants of those epochs could remain embedded in the earth, discovered by later generations who lack the interpretive key to understand their origin. The Shemitot framework thus provides a mystical concordance with scientific observation, allowing for an ancient cosmos while maintaining the literal truth of Genesis as the account of the current cycle's beginning. The notion that the letter Beit encodes the number of inhabited worlds has implications beyond numerology. In Jewish tradition, the choice of Beit as the opening letter of the Torah, rather than Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, has been the subject of extensive commentary. Some suggest that Aleph represents the singular, unknowable unity of God, while Beit represents duality, the emergence of distinction and otherness necessary for creation. By beginning with Beit, the Torah signals that creation involves separation, light from darkness, waters above from waters below, day from night. The numerical value of 2, then, is not merely a count of cycles but a theological statement about the nature of existence itself, division, relationship, and the interplay of opposites. The 4 crowns atop the Beit add another layer of meaning. In Kabbalistic interpretation, these ornamental marks are not decorative accidents but deliberate encodings of hidden knowledge. Some mystics associate the 4 crowns with the 4 letters of the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, Yod-He-Vav-He, each representing a different level of divine emanation and a different world within the cosmic hierarchy. Others link them to the 4 foundational elements, fire, water, air, and earth, that constitute the building blocks of material reality in ancient philosophy. Still others read the 4 crowns as markers of the 4th Shemitah, suggesting that 3 prior cycles have already passed, and we are living in the 4th, moving toward the 5th. If the present world is indeed the 2nd or 4th cycle, the question arises, what characterized the worlds that came before? The mystical texts offer few specifics. Some suggest that the first cycle was governed by the Sephira of mercy alone, resulting in a world of unrestrained grace, but lacking the boundaries necessary for free will and moral development. Without the counterbalance of judgment, the beings of that world could not experience consequence, growth, or the discipline required for holiness. The cycle was therefore dissolved, and a new one initiated under different governance. Others propose that prior cycles lacked human life altogether, populated instead by other forms of consciousness, angelic, elemental, or something entirely beyond our categories. The Kabbalistic model differs fundamentally from the gap theory in that it does not require catastrophe to explain the formlessness of Genesis 1:2. The void is not a punishment, but a transition, the natural pause between one cosmic phase and another. The darkness that covers the deep is not imposed by judgment, but represents the withdrawal of the previous cycle's light as the world enters its sabbatical rest. When the new cycle begins, light is restored, not as a reclamation of something lost to rebellion, but as the activation of the next phase in the divine plan. The 6 days of Genesis, then, are the inauguration of a new Shemitah, the cosmic work week that will last 6,000 years before giving way to the 7th millennium of rest. This framework also reshapes the understanding of Adam's role. Rather than being the first human to ever exist, Adam becomes the first human of the current cycle, the progenitor of the civilization that will flourish during this Shemitah. If prior cycles featured human-like beings, they would have had their own first parents, their own genealogies, and their own destinies. Adam's uniqueness lies not in being the absolute first, but in being the first of this world, the one governed by the particular Sephira now in operation. His creation marks the beginning of the present epoch, not the beginning of time itself. The mystical arithmetic of the Shemitot extends beyond the 7 cycles to the Jubilee that follows them. Just as the land of Israel experiences release and restoration in the 50th year, so the cosmos, after 7 cycles of 7,000 years each, enters a 50th millennium of ultimate rest and renewal. This cosmic jubilee is sometimes identified with the world to come, the eschatological state in which creation is perfected, and the divine plan reaches its consummation. After the jubilee, some Kabbalists suggest, the entire sequence begins again, an eternal rhythm of creation and dissolution that reflects the boundless creativity of the divine. The doctrine of Shemitot has not been universally accepted within Jewish tradition. It appears primarily in mystical and Kabbalistic circles, where symbolic and esoteric readings of Scripture are valued alongside the plain sense. Mainstream rabbinic commentary tends to focus on the legal, ethical, and narrative dimensions of the text, treating the creation account as a unique event rather than one iteration of a recurring pattern. Yet the Shemitot framework has persisted for centuries, transmitted through works like Sefer HaTemunah, the writings of Rabbeinu Beche, and later Kabbalistic texts that elaborate on the cosmic structure of the Sefirot. By the close of this chapter, the mystical cosmology of the Shemitot stands as an alternative to both the literal reading of Genesis and the gap theory, where the former sees a singular creation and the latter sees ruin and restoration. The Kabbalistic model sees a cycle, one of many. The enlarged bait at the opening of Bereshit becomes a cipher, encoding the secret that our world is not the first. The formless void of Genesis 1:2 is not chaos imposed by rebellion, but the natural pause between epochs. The 6 days are not reclamation but inauguration, the beginning of a phase that will last millennia before dissolving into rest and giving way to the next. Genesis, in this framework, is not the story of absolute origins but the record of the current cycle's beginning, a chapter in a much longer book, written in rhythms of 7,000 years, governed by divine emanations, and destined to repeat until the cosmic jubilee arrives and the pattern at last is complete. The mystical cosmology of Shemitot presents creation as a rhythmic sequence, but it is not the only Kabbalistic framework that imagines multiple worlds preceding the present order. A parallel tradition, also rooted in medieval Jewish mysticism, proposes a more radical vision, that the universe has undergone a cascade of prior realities, each incomplete or unsuitable, each dismantled before the next emerged. These worlds were not destroyed by judgment, nor did they dissolve according to a predetermined sabbatical rhythm. Instead, they were experiments in divine manifestation, attempts to unfold the infinite into the finite, each revealing limitations that necessitated its dissolution and the initiation of a new order. The primary text advancing this vision is Sefer HaTemunah, a 13th or 14th century Kabbalistic work attributed by some to Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana, a Tana of the Second Temple period, though modern scholarship dates its composition much later. The title translates as Book of the Figure, referring to the shapes of the Hebrew letters, which the text treats as vessels encoding hidden cosmological truths. Central to Sefer HaTemunah is the assertion that God creates worlds and destroys them, a claim supported by a passage from the Midrash. God created universes and destroys them. This statement, cryptic in its original context, is interpreted by the Kabbalists as evidence that the present cosmos is not the first attempt at creation, but one iteration among many. Unlike the Shemitot model, which envisions 7 cycles of equal duration governed by the 7 lower Sefirot, the framework of Sefer HaTemunah proposes that earlier worlds were governed by different divine names and operated under different laws of nature. Each of these names, Elohim, Elohim Jibber, YHVH, represents a distinct mode of divine interaction with the created order. A world governed by El, the name associated with the Sephirah of mercy, would be structured around principles of loving kindness, grace, and unrestricted benevolence. One governed by Elohim Jibber, the name linked to judgment, would emphasize law, discipline, and consequence. The nature of each world, including its physical laws, moral structures, and the capacities of its inhabitants, would be determined by the divine name under which it was constituted. The text suggests that each of these prior worlds was found lacking. A world governed solely by mercy might lack the boundaries necessary for ethical development, collapsing into formlessness due to the absence of structure. One ruled entirely by judgment might be too rigid, unable to sustain life under the weight of unrelenting law. Each world was an exploration of a particular divine attribute taken to its logical extreme, and each revealed the inadequacy of that attribute in isolation. The dissolution of these worlds was not catastrophic but intentional, a divine recognition that the conditions were not yet suitable for the ultimate purpose of creation, whatever that purpose might be. According to some interpreters of Sefer HaTemunah, we are living in the second world, governed by the Sephirah of Jevurah, judgment or severity, and therefore the Torah we possess is a Torah of Jevurah, structured around commandments, prohibitions, and consequences. The first world, by contrast, was governed by Hesed mercy, and its inhabitants received a Torah of Hesed, centered on grace and forgiveness rather than law. When that world proved unstable or insufficient, it was dissolved, and the present world was inaugurated under different governance. Another tradition, recorded by Joseph Angeline in Sefer Livnat HaSapir, claims that we are not the second but the last world in the sequence, suggesting that all prior attempts have been exhausted, and that this present order represents the final configuration before the cosmic plan reaches its fulfillment. The number of prior worlds varies across Kabbalistic sources. Some propose that 6 worlds were created and destroyed before the appearance of Adam, meaning that the present cosmos is the 7th and final iteration. Rabbi Isaac ben Samuel of Acre, a 13th century Kabbalist, calculated that if this is the case, Adam was created when the universe was already 42,000 years old, with each prior world lasting 7,000 years. This chronology allowed for a cosmos far older than the biblical genealogy suggests, accommodating the notion that vast epochs preceded the emergence of humanity. The formless void of Genesis 1:2 under this reading is not the result of angelic rebellion or the pause between sabbatical cycles, but the residue of a prior world, its structures dissolved, its inhabitants vanished, its laws suspended in preparation for the next attempt. The soul of Adam occupies a unique position in this cosmology. Kabbalistic tradition teaches that Adam's soul was not an isolated individual spark, but a composite structure containing within it all the souls of humanity. The Lurianic school describes Adam's soul as encompassing 600,000 root souls, each of which further divides into countless sparks, producing the billions of individual human souls that would eventually incarnate. This immense soul, known as Adam's great soul, was intended to perform the tikkun, the rectification and reclamation of the holy sparks that had fallen into disorder during the cosmic rupture known as the Shevirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. Some Kabbalists have speculated that Adam's composite soul contains not only the sparks of future humanity, but also remnants from the prior worlds, fragments of consciousness that survived the dissolution of earlier orders and were absorbed into the structure of the present creation. These sparks carry within them memories, potentials, and patterns from realities that no longer exist. The soul of Adam, then, becomes a repository of cosmic history, a vessel encoding traces of the worlds that were and were not. When Adam sinned and his soul shattered, these ancient sparks scattered across the earth, mingling with the material realm and awaiting restoration through the spiritual work of his descendants. This notion transforms the formless void of Genesis 1:2 from a barrier into a bridge. If the chaos described in the second verse represents the dissolved state of a prior world, it also contains the raw material from which the present world is fashioned. The darkness, the deep, the waters, all are not empty nothingness but saturated remnants, the unformed substance of what once was. The 6 days of creation would then involve not the calling into being of entirely new matter, but the reshaping of existing material into a new configuration, governed by a new divine name and oriented toward a new purpose. The light that appears on the first day does not dispel absolute darkness, but penetrates the darkness of the prior world's dissolution, introducing the presence of the new order. The concept of iterative creation, worlds built, tested, and dissolved, challenges the notion of divine perfection in ways that theologians have found both troubling and generative. If God is perfect and omniscient, why would multiple attempts be necessary? The Kabbalistic response is that the iterations do not reflect divine inadequacy, but the unfolding of a pedagogical process. Each world serves as a stage in the revelation of divine attributes, and each contributes to the ultimate synthesis that will emerge only when all possibilities have been explored. The prior worlds were not failures but necessary experiments, each one revealing dimensions of the divine will that could not be disclosed in any other way. The teaching also addresses the problem of evil. If the present world contains suffering, disorder, and moral complexity, it is because it is governed by Jevurah, the attribute of judgment, which introduces limitation, consequence, and the possibility of failure. A world governed entirely by Hesed would lack these elements, but it would also lack the conditions necessary for free will, moral choice, and the elevation of the soul through struggle. The dissolution of that world and the creation of the present one under Jevurah was not a punishment but a refinement, the establishment of a realm in which beings could choose, fail, repent, and ultimately achieve a transformation unavailable in a world of unrestrained grace. The mystical tradition records debates about the nature of the Torah in the prior worlds. If different worlds are governed by different divine names, do they also receive different revelations? Some Kabbalists argue that the Torah is eternal and unchanging, existing in a primordial form before any world was created. Others propose that the Torah adapts to the conditions of each world, emphasizing different commandments and principles depending on the dominant Sefirot. The Torah of Hesed would highlight acts of kindness, generosity, and compassion. The Torah of Jevurah would emphasize justice, restraint, and discipline. The Torah given to Moses on Sinai, then, would be the version suited to the present world, calibrated to guide beings living under the governance of judgment toward balance and righteousness. The dissolution of prior worlds also raises the question of their inhabitants. If these worlds were populated, what became of the beings who lived in them? The texts do not provide clear answers. Some suggest that the souls of prior world inhabitants were reabsorbed into the divine, their individual identities dissolved along with the structures that sustained them. Others propose that these souls entered a kind of cosmic hibernation, waiting to be reawakened in a future world, or absorbed into the souls of beings in the present order. The possibility that Adam's soul contains sparks from prior worlds implies a continuity of consciousness across cosmic epochs, as though the beings of earlier realities persist in fragmented form within the architecture of the present creation. The physical remnants of these prior worlds pose interpretive challenges. If entire universes existed before the present one, might traces of them remain embedded in the material fabric of our reality? Some Kabbalists have suggested that fossils, ancient geological strata, and extinct species represent not stages in the evolution of the current world, but relics of prior creations whose structures were partially preserved when they dissolved. This reading allows for an ancient earth and a recent humanity, reconciling mystical cosmology with empirical observation, without requiring symbolic reinterpretation of the Genesis days. The iterative model also reshapes the understanding of eschatology. If creation is a series of experiments moving toward an ultimate goal, the end of the present world is not an absolute termination, but another transition. The dissolution of our cosmos would mirror the dissolution of those that preceded it, clearing the ground for a new configuration governed by a different divine name and oriented toward the next phase of the unfolding plan. The world to come, in this framework, is not the restoration of Eden, but the inauguration of an entirely new order, one that incorporates the lessons of all prior worlds and achieves the synthesis that earlier attempts only approximated. By the close of this chapter, creation is no longer a singular act but a process, iterative, exploratory, and cumulative. The worlds that were and were not are not anomalies but essential phases in the divine pedagogy, each one revealing a facet of the infinite that could not be disclosed in isolation. The formless void of Genesis 1:2 becomes a transitional state, the pause between experiments, the dissolution of one order and the preparation for the next. Adam's soul carries within it sparks from these vanished realities, making humanity the inheritor of a cosmic history far older than the genealogies suggest. The 6 days of creation are not the beginning of all things, but the beginning of this thing, the present world, governed by judgment, structured by law, and tasked with the work of rectification. Genesis, in this reading, is not the story of origins but the story of emergence. the moment when the latest iteration began, built upon the ruins of what came before, striving toward a completion that will justify all the worlds that were created, dissolved, and absorbed into the foundation of the one that now is. The second day of creation stands apart from the others by what it lacks. On each of the remaining 5 days, the Creator looks upon his work and pronounces it good. The light of the first day is good. The gathered seas and dry land of the third day are good. The luminaries of the fourth day, the creatures of the fifth, and the beasts and humanity of the sixth, all are declared good, and at the week's conclusion, the entire work is pronounced very good. Yet the account of the second day, where the waters are divided, contains no such affirmation. The firmament is made, the separation is accomplished, evening and morning mark the passage of time, but the text is silent on the quality of the work. This omission has prompted centuries of commentary, with interpreters offering explanations that range from the technical to the symbolic, from the benign to the troubling. The second day's work is described in Genesis 1:6-8. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament and separated the waters that were under the firmament from the waters that were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. The Hebrew term translated as firmament is rakia, derived from a root meaning to beat out or spread, suggesting a solid expanse that holds back the waters above. The cosmology implied is one in which the earth is surrounded by water, below in the form of seas and oceans, and above in some form that remains the subject of debate. The firmament functions as a barrier, preventing the upper waters from collapsing onto the lower, maintaining a habitable space between them. One explanation for the absence of the good declaration is that the second day involved no new act of creation, but rather the organization of material already present. On the first day, the Creator called forth light and separated it from darkness, establishing the rhythm of day and night. The water that covers the earth in Genesis 1:2 is already there when the second day begins, dark and formless. The work of the second day is not to create the waters, but to impose boundaries upon them, dividing them into 2 realms above and below so that a space might exist in which life can later flourish. If no new substance was brought into being, some commentators suggest the declaration of good was not appropriate, reserved instead for acts of original creation. Another interpretation focuses on the nature of division itself. The second day is dominated by the act of separation, waters divided from waters, a firmament placed in the midst. Separation, in certain rabbinic traditions, carries negative connotations. It is associated with conflict, estrangement, and the introduction of boundaries that did not previously exist. The word for separation, havdalah, also appears in contexts of exile and division among peoples. Rabbi Daniel Lapin notes that the second day mentions separation twice, and that this theme of division may explain why the day is not called good. Division is necessary for order. Light must be separated from darkness, day from night, sacred from profane. But it also introduces the possibility of opposition, of forces that resist integration. The waters, divided but not transformed, remain as they were, chaotic substance now contained but not redeemed. A third perspective suggests that the waters themselves are the issue. In ancient Near Eastern cosmology, water is the primordial element, the substance that predates ordered creation and symbolizes chaos. The Babylonian creation epic, Enuma Elish, begins with Apsu and Tiamat, the fresh and salt waters, mingling in formless unity before the gods emerge and impose structure through violent conflict. In Egyptian mythology, the waters of Nun represent the boundless, chaotic expanse from which the first land emerges, the formless abyss that surrounds the created order and threatens always to reclaim it. The Hebrew creation account differs from these mythologies in its monotheism and its lack of divine struggle, but it shares the motif of primordial waters as the starting condition. The deep tehem of Genesis 1:2 echoes Tiamat in sound and function, though it is not personified or deified. If the waters are remnants, holdovers from the pre-Adamic state, or from the formless void that preceded the 6 days, then their presence on the second day may explain the absence of the good declaration. The waters are not created on the second day. They are managed. The firmament does not eliminate them but imposes containment, ensuring that the waters above do not collapse and the waters below do not overflow. The space between them is carved out, a temporary refuge in the midst of chaos, but the chaos itself is not removed. It persists above and below, held at bay but never fully subdued. The second day, then, is not yet complete in the way the other days are. It is a provisional arrangement, a structural necessity that prepares the ground for later work, but does not achieve the kind of resolution that warrants the pronouncement of goodness. The third day offers further insight into the structure of the second. On day 3, God commands the waters below to gather into one place so that dry land may appear. Once the seas are gathered and the land is revealed, the text declares, "And God saw that it was good." The work of the third day completes what the second day began. The waters below, which were separated from the waters above on day 2, are now gathered and confined to designated boundaries on day 3. Only when this confinement is finalized does the declaration of goodness appear. Some interpreters conclude that the absence of "it was good" on the second day reflects the incomplete nature of the water's management. The division was initiated, but the containment was not finished until the third day. The goodness proclaimed on day 3 applies retroactively to the work begun on day 2, affirming the entire process of water organization rather than treating the second day in isolation. This reading preserves the integrity of the Creator's work without introducing problematic elements into the second day itself. The waters are not inherently evil or chaotic in a malevolent sense. They are simply unfinished, awaiting the further ordering that will occur when dry land emerges. Yet the sequential nature of this explanation does not fully address the symbolic weight of water throughout Scripture. Water is not neutral. It appears as both blessing and threat, life-giving and destructive, depending on its containment. The flood of Noah's time returns the world to a condition resembling Genesis 1:2, waters covering the earth, chaos reasserting itself as judgment falls. The parting of the Red Sea reverses the pattern, dividing waters to create a path of deliverance, a new creation moment for the people of Israel. The imagery of water as chaos recurs in the Psalms, where the raging seas represent forces opposed to divine order, subdued only by the Creator's command. The waters above the firmament present a particular mystery. The text describes them as separated and held in place, but it does not explain their nature or purpose. Various theories have been proposed. Some ancient and medieval interpreters envisioned literal reservoirs of water suspended above the sky, held in place by the solid dome of the firmament, released through windows or floodgates when rain falls. This cosmology, often called the canopy theory, suggests that the upper waters formed a thick vapor layer or crystalline dome surrounding the earth, maintaining a greenhouse-like environment before the flood. When the windows of heaven were opened and the fountains of the deep burst forth in Genesis 7, this canopy collapsed, contributing to the deluge that submerged the earth. Modern readers often struggle with the cosmology implied by the waters above, as contemporary atmospheric science describes no such reservoir. Some interpreters propose that the waters above refer to clouds, moisture suspended in the atmosphere and released as precipitation. Others suggest a more symbolic reading. The upper waters represent the realm of divine presence, the heavenly domain separated from the earthly by the firmament, just as the veil in the temple separates the Holy of Holies from the outer courts. On this view, the division of waters on the second day establishes the boundary between the material and the spiritual, the created and the transcendent. The absence of "it was good" may reflect the fact that this boundary is not a feature of the original divine unity, but a concession to the limitations of created existence, a necessary separation, but not one that reflects the ultimate harmony intended in the eschaton, when heaven and earth will be reunited. The persistence of water as an unresolved element extends beyond the second day. Even after the seas are gathered and the land appears, even after vegetation grows and animals populate the earth, water remains. The rivers of Eden flow from a single source and divide into four, watering the garden and the lands beyond. The flood demonstrates that the waters, though contained, are never eliminated. They can be released again, returning the world to formlessness if the Creator wills it. The cosmology of Genesis does not envision the final removal of water, but its ongoing management, a perpetual containment that requires divine maintenance. The world exists in a space carved out from chaos, not in a realm where chaos has been eradicated. This interpretation resonates with the gap theory's claim that the formless void of Genesis 1:2 is not original creation, but a later condition. If the waters are remnants of a prior state, whether the dissolved world of the Shemitot, the aftermath of angelic rebellion, or the transition between cosmic experiments, then their presence on the second day represents the persistence of that prior order into the present one. The firmament does not create new material, it reorganizes what remains, imposing structure on the residue of what came before. The waters, in this sense, are witnesses, substances that predate the 6 days and carry within them the memory of the formlessness from which the present world emerged. The theme of water as chaos also appears in the prophetic and poetic literature. Isaiah 51:9-10 recalls the ancient act of creation. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over? The language conflates creation with deliverance, treating the division of waters as an act of conquest over chaotic forces personified as Rahab and the dragon. Psalm 74:13-14 similarly declares, "You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan." These passages draw on mythic imagery common in the ancient Near East, where creation involves the defeat of a sea monster representing primordial chaos. The Hebrew text does not personify the waters in the same way the Babylonian myths do, but the symbolic association persists. Water is the element that must be subdued, divided, and constrained for order to prevail. The absence of "it was good" on the second day, then, may signal not a defect in the work, but an acknowledgement of its provisional nature. The division of waters is necessary, but it is not final. The containment holds, but it is not absolute. The space between the waters is habitable, but it remains surrounded by the very substance that symbolizes disorder. The second day establishes the conditions for life, but it does not eliminate the threat. It carves out a refuge in the midst of chaos, a temporary dwelling that depends on the continued will of the Creator to maintain the boundaries and keep the waters in their assigned places. By the close of this chapter, the waters of Genesis emerge as more than physical substance. They are remnants, symbols, and evidence. They carry the memory of the formless void, the transition between what was and what is. The firmament divides them but does not transform them. The seas are gathered but not removed. The upper waters remain, unseen and unexplained, held above the sky by structures the text does not fully describe. The second day's work is essential, but it is incomplete, a division that prepares the way for further creation, but which does not achieve the resolution that allows for the declaration of goodness. The waters, divided and contained, preserve in their very existence the trace of what came before. The deep, the darkness, the formless expanse from which the present order was carved, and to which it might yet return. The first command issued in the Genesis account is stark and immediate. Let there be light. The Hebrew phrase, yehi, or consists of only 2 words, yet it initiates the transformation of the formless void into ordered creation. The response is instantaneous. Light appears, and God separates it from the darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. The cycle of evening and morning establishes the first day. Yet 3 days later, on the 4th day, the text records another act of creation. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to separate the day from the night." The sun, moon, and stars are made and placed in the sky to govern the day and the night, to mark seasons and years, and to give light upon the earth. The sequence raises an immediate question. If the sun is the source of daylight, how could there be light? And how could there be day and night before the sun existed? The tension has generated interpretive responses spanning millennia. Some early Jewish sages proposed that the luminaries were created on the first day, but not positioned in the firmament until the 4th. According to this reading, the sun, moon, and stars existed as physical objects from day 1, but their orbits were erratic, or their light was not yet functioning in its final form. On the 4th day, God assigned them their proper places and roles, fixing their courses and activating their function as timekeepers and light givers. This interpretation preserves the integrity of the sequence, while avoiding the implication that light existed independently of the luminaries. Yet the text of Genesis 1:14 does not say that pre-existing lights were arranged. It says, "Let there be lights," using the same construction as the original command for light on day 1, suggesting an act of bringing into being rather than repositioning. Another approach distinguishes between light as a substance and the luminaries as generators of that substance. On this view, God created light itself on the first day, a diffuse ambient luminance that filled the cosmos and allowed for the division of day and night as the earth rotated on its axis. This light radiated from a fixed source, providing directional illumination that created periods of brightness and darkness as the earth turned, just as the sun does in the present order. On the 4th day, God created the celestial bodies that would henceforth serve as the permanent sources and regulators of light, concentrating the diffuse luminance of day 1 into specific, localized generators. The sun became the greater light to govern the day, the moon the lesser light to govern the night, and the stars were set in place as additional markers and sources. The light of the first day was temporary, a provisional arrangement that served its purpose for 3 days before being replaced by the more familiar astronomical system. Gap theorists have proposed a different reading. If the formless void of Genesis 1:2 represents the ruined state of a prior creation, the darkness that covers the deep is not the absence of light in an absolute sense, but the withdrawal of light that had previously existed. The original creation of Genesis 1:1, they suggest, would have possessed its own light source, whether the sun and stars created at that initial moment, or some other form of illumination associated with the divine presence. When judgment fell and the earth became formless, the light was extinguished, shrouding the world in darkness. The command, "Let there be light," on the first day would then represent not the first introduction of light into the cosmos, but its restoration after a prolonged absence. The luminaries created on the 4th day might be new installations, replacing whatever light source had existed in the pre-Adamic world, or they might be the reconstitution of the original sun and stars, darkened during the catastrophe and now rekindled. This reading finds support in the symbolic association of darkness with judgment throughout Scripture. When the plagues fall upon Egypt, darkness covers the land for 3 days, a darkness so thick it can be felt, a tangible manifestation of divine displeasure. The prophets describe the day of the Lord as a day of darkness and gloom, when the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood. The crucifixion of Christ is accompanied by darkness over the land from the 6th hour to the 9th, a cosmic response to the act of execution. If darkness signifies judgment, the darkness of Genesis 1:2 may not be neutral but punitive, a condition imposed upon the earth as a consequence of events unrecorded in the text. The restoration of light on day 1 would then mark the lifting of judgment, the return of divine favor, and the beginning of renewal. Jewish mystical tradition offers yet another framework for understanding the primordial light. The Talmud and later Kabbalistic texts speak of the Ohr HaGanuz, the hidden light, a luminance of extraordinary power created on the first day but withdrawn shortly thereafter. According to this tradition, the light of day 1 was not ordinary physical light, but a spiritual radiance that allowed Adam to see from one end of the world to the other. It was a light that revealed hidden things, penetrated all barriers, and conveyed knowledge beyond the capacity of natural vision. When God foresaw that future generations would misuse this light, he hid it away, reserving it for the righteous in the world to come. The light that illuminates the present world, the light from the sun, moon, and stars, is a diminished substitute, functional but far less potent than the original radiance. The concept of the hidden light transforms the relationship between day 1 and day 4. The light created on the first day was not a precursor to the sun, but a reality of an entirely different order, spiritual rather than material, eternal rather than temporal. It permeated creation for 36 hours, the duration of the first day and the night that followed, before being concealed. On the fourth day, God introduced the celestial luminaries to provide the physical light necessary for the continuation of the created order. But these lights are secondary, substitutes for the primordial radiance that humanity lost access to after the sin of Adam. The festival of Chanukah, according to Kabbalistic teaching, offers an annual opportunity to reconnect with the Ohr HaGanuz, to draw from the wellspring of that hidden light and experience, however briefly, the spiritual illumination that once filled the world. The notion of spiritual light as distinct from physical light resonates with passages elsewhere in Scripture. Revelation 21:23 describes the New Jerusalem. The city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. The eschatological vision presents a realm in which celestial bodies are unnecessary, where divine presence itself provides illumination. If the world to come requires no sun, it suggests that light need not depend on astronomical sources, that luminance can originate directly from the divine without mediation through created objects. The light of the first day, then, might prefigure this ultimate state, a radiance rooted not in burning gases and nuclear fusion, but in the unmediated presence of the Creator. This interpretation also accounts for the sequence of the creation week. If the light of day 1 is divine radiance and the lights of day 4 are physical generators, the progression reflects a movement from the spiritual to the material, from the direct to the mediated. The early days of creation involve foundational realities, light, firmament, land, and sea, while the later days populate those structures with specific forms: vegetation, celestial bodies, animals, humanity. The light that appears first is the most fundamental, the precondition for all that follows, while the sun and stars are refinements, mechanisms to sustain and regulate the light in an ongoing, stable manner. The creation of the luminaries on the fourth day does not contradict the light of the first day, but institutionalizes it, transferring the function of illumination from a temporary provision to a permanent system. The gap theories claim that the first light represents restoration, rather than original creation, finds a parallel in the mystical teaching about the hidden light. If the Ohr HaGanuz was withdrawn after being revealed, and if the world now operates under the lesser light of the sun, there is a sense in which the present order is a diminishment of the original state. The light that shines today is not the light that was, and the luminaries of day 4 are compensations for a loss, whether the loss of the hidden light, or the loss of the pre-Adamic illumination that was darkened when judgment fell. Either way, the sequence suggests that the present world is not the fullest expression of divine intent, but a provisional arrangement that will one day be superseded by the return of the primordial radiance. The role of the luminaries on the 4th day extends beyond mere illumination. Genesis 1:14 specifies that they are to serve for signs and for seasons, and for days and years. The sun and moon become instruments of timekeeping, marking the rhythms of the liturgical calendar and the cycles of human life. Sabbaths, festivals, and years of jubilee are all measured by the movements of these celestial bodies. In this sense, the lights of day 4 are not just physical objects but theological markers, embedding the structure of divine commandment into the fabric of creation. The absence of such markers on day 1 suggests that the primordial light, whatever its nature, was not subject to temporal regulation. It existed in a realm beyond time, or in a time structured differently from the days and years governed by the sun and moon. Some interpreters have suggested that the first light was not a visible phenomenon at all, but a metaphor for divine wisdom or order. In this symbolic reading, "Let there be light" announces the introduction of intelligibility into the chaos of the formless void, the imposition of structure, law, and meaning onto a realm that previously lacked them. Light in this framework represents clarity, revelation, and the capacity for knowledge, while darkness symbolizes ignorance, confusion, and the absence of understanding. The separation of light from darkness on day 1 would then signify the establishment of rational order, the beginning of a cosmos in which things can be distinguished, named, and known. The creation of the sun and stars on day 4 would be the physical instantiation of this metaphysical principle, the embedding of order into the material realm through the regularity of astronomical cycles. Yet the text resists purely symbolic readings. The light of day 1 produces a measurable effect, evening and morning the first day. The passage of time begins, implying that the light functions in a manner similar to the sun, even if it is not yet the sun. The separation of light from darkness is described in spatial terms. God divides one from the other, suggesting a directional source of illumination that creates regions of brightness and shadow as the earth rotates. The simplest explanation, favored by many interpreters, is that God created a temporary light source on day 1, positioned it to provide directional luminance, and allowed the rotation of the earth to generate the cycle of day and night for 3 days before replacing this provisional light with the permanent system of sun, moon, and stars on day 4. The theological implications of this sequence are significant. If God can create light without the sun, it demonstrates that the natural order is not autonomous but entirely dependent on divine will. The sun is not the ultimate source of light. It is an instrument through which light is mediated. The Creator is capable of bypassing the instrument, of providing illumination directly, and of sustaining the cycles of day and night through means other than the familiar astronomical mechanisms. The light of day 1, whether understood as spiritual radiance, restored luminance, or temporary provision, establishes the principle that God is the origin of all light, and that celestial bodies serve His purposes rather than functioning as independent powers. The sequence also invites reflection on the nature of beginnings. If the first light was withdrawn or replaced, it suggests that creation involves stages, transitions, and the replacement of provisional arrangements with permanent structures. The world we inhabit is not the world as it was on day 1, nor is it the world as it will be in the age to come. It is an intermediate state, operating under systems that were introduced on the fourth day and will endure until they are no longer needed. The hidden light, if it exists, awaits its unveiling. The sun and moon, necessary now, will one day be rendered obsolete by the return of the primordial radiance that filled the cosmos before celestial bodies were made. By the close of this chapter, the light before the sun emerges as one of the most enduring mysteries of the creation account. It is light that exists independently of the luminaries, that functions without the mechanisms familiar to human experience, that serves its purpose for 3 days and then gives way to the stars. Whether it is spiritual radiance, restored illumination from a prior creation, or a temporary provision designed to be replaced, it establishes the principle that light originates not in celestial fires, but in the command of the Creator. The sun, moon, and stars of day 4 are instruments, not sources, means by which the light introduced on day 1 is sustained and regulated in the ongoing order of the present world. The primordial light, hidden or replaced, remains a trace of the original condition, a witness to the possibility that the cosmos once operated under principles different from those that govern it now, and that it may one day do so again. The voice from the whirlwind addresses Job with a question that pierces human pride. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? The passage is poetic, employing the imagery of construction, foundations, measurements, cornerstone to describe the formation of the earth. Yet embedded in the poetry is a striking claim. The creation of the world was witnessed. Beings were present, observing and celebrating as the foundations were laid. The morning stars and the sons of God are identified by the majority of interpreters as angelic beings, heavenly hosts who existed before the earth took shape and who responded to its formation with song and exultation. The implication is clear. Angels predate humanity. Job, like all mortals, was absent when the earth was founded. He has no first-hand knowledge of the event, no memory of the creative act, no basis from which to challenge the wisdom of the Creator. But the angels do. They were there, standing as witnesses to the unfolding of the divine plan. This raises an immediate question. When exactly were the angels created? The Genesis account does not mention them. The 6 days enumerate light, firmament, land and sea, vegetation, celestial bodies, marine and aerial creatures, land animals, and humanity. But nowhere do angels appear in the sequence. Their absence from the narrative is conspicuous, especially given their prominence elsewhere in Scripture as messengers, warriors, and worshipers. Several interpretive traditions attempt to locate the moment of angelic creation within the Genesis framework. One proposal places their creation on the first day, included within the phrase, God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens in Genesis 1:1 on this reading encompass not only the physical sky but the spiritual realm, the domain where angelic beings dwell. When God brought the heavens into existence, He simultaneously populated them with the hosts who would serve and worship Him. This would mean that angels existed from the very beginning, present before the formless void of verse 2, and thus potential witnesses to both the original creation and whatever transpired between verses 1 and 2. Another tradition suggests that angels were created on the second day, when the firmament was made and the waters divided. The firmament, described as separating the waters above from the waters below, establishes a boundary between the earthly and the heavenly realms. The creation of this boundary might coincide with the creation of the inhabitants of the upper realm, the angels who dwell in the heavens and minister before the throne. Yet this interpretation faces the difficulty posed by Job 38:7, which describes the angelic hosts shouting for joy when the foundations of the earth were laid. If the laying of foundations occurred on the third day, when the land emerged from the waters, the angels would need to have been created earlier, either on the first or second day. A third view holds that angels were created before the 6 days began, during the unspecified period covered by Genesis 1:1. On this reading, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," describes an initial, complete act of creation that included the formation of the angelic realm. The formless void of Genesis 1:2 would then represent a later condition, and the 6 days would describe the restoration or reorganization of a world that had fallen into chaos after the angels were already present. This framework aligns with the gap theory, allowing for angelic witnesses to both the pristine beginning and the catastrophe that necessitated the 6-day renewal. What is certain is that angels existed before humanity. The serpent in the Garden of Eden is identified in later scripture as Satan, the fallen angel who rebelled against God. His presence in the garden, tempting Eve, implies that his fall from grace had already occurred by the time Adam and Eve were created. If Satan fell before the events of Genesis 3, his rebellion must have taken place either during the interval between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, or sometime within the 6 days but prior to the 6th day when humanity appeared. The former option is preferred by those who advocate the gap theory, as it provides a narrative mechanism for the transformation of the earth from order to chaos. Satan's rebellion resulted in his expulsion from heaven and the imposition of darkness and formlessness upon the earth he had been appointed to govern. The role of angels as witnesses carries theological weight. Unlike humanity, which receives knowledge of creation through revelation and tradition, angels possess direct memory of the event. They saw the foundations laid, the waters divided, the lights set in the firmament. They observed the emergence of life, vegetation, fish, birds, beasts, and the formation of Adam from the dust. If the gap theory is correct, they also witnessed the pristine creation of Genesis 1:1, the subsequent catastrophe, and the 6-day restoration. Angels, then, are the only continuous thread linking the world that was to the world that is. They carry within their memories the knowledge of events that preceded the existence of humanity, including the origin of evil, the fall of their own kind, and the transformation of the cosmos from one state to another. The song of the morning stars and the shout of the sons of God in Job 38:7 suggest not mere observation but participation. The angels did not watch in silence. They responded with joy, celebration, and praise. The laying of the earth's foundations was not a mundane act, but a moment of cosmic significance, worthy of exaltation. This raises the question of what the angels understood about the event they were witnessing. Did they perceive it as the first creation, the original establishment of order? Or did they recognize it as a restoration, a renewal of something that had been lost? If angels had existed long enough to witness a prior world, their joy at the laying of foundations might reflect relief. The end of chaos, the return of structure, the beginning of a new order after an interval of darkness and desolation. The identification of the morning stars with angels adds another layer of meaning. Stars in biblical literature often symbolize celestial beings, spiritual entities associated with the heavenly realm. In Isaiah 14, the fallen figure is called Day Star, son of dawn, linking a rebellious angel to stellar imagery. Revelation 1:20 identifies the 7 stars in Christ's hand as the angels of the 7 churches, equating stars with angelic overseers. Daniel 12:3 speaks of the righteous shining like the stars forever, a metaphor that suggests continuity between human destiny and the angelic order. The morning stars of Job 38:7, then, are not literal celestial bodies but angelic beings whose brightness and glory reflect the light of the Creator. Their song at the foundation of the earth is an act of worship, an acknowledgement that the work being done is good, purposeful, and aligned with divine intent. Yet not all angels remained in this posture of worship. The tradition of angelic rebellion introduces a fracture into the heavenly order, a division among the sons of God that parallels the division of light from darkness, waters from waters, and land from sea. Revelation 12:4 states that the dragon's tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth, imagery understood as depicting the fall of a significant portion of the angelic host who followed Satan in his insurrection. These fallen angels, expelled from their positions of honor, became adversaries of the divine plan and agents of disorder in the created realm. If their rebellion occurred before the formation of humanity, they would have been present as witnesses to both the original creation and the subsequent events, carrying knowledge of the cosmos that exceeds human comprehension. The timing of the angelic rebellion remains contested. Some interpreters place it before the 6 days, during the interval between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, making the rebellion the cause of the earth's formlessness. Others situate it after the creation of humanity, but before the temptation in the garden, viewing Satan's resentment of Adam and Eve, beings made in the image of God and granted dominion over the earth, as the catalyst for his fall. Still others propose that the rebellion occurred in stages, an initial pride and discontent that predated the 6 days, followed by an escalation during or after the formation of humanity that culminated in outright opposition. Each timeline carries different implications for the role of angels as witnesses. If they fell before the 6 days, they observed the restoration work from a state of exile and opposition. If they fell after, their memories of the creation week are those of loyal servants who only later turned against their Creator. The knowledge possessed by angels, both loyal and fallen, makes them unique actors in the cosmic drama. They remember what humanity does not. They witness the origins of the present order, and if the gap theory is correct, the dissolution of the prior one. The fallen angels, in particular, carry knowledge that they may use to deceive, distort, and undermine the purposes of God. Satan, appearing as the serpent in Eden, claims to know what will happen if the forbidden fruit is eaten. You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The statement is partially true and partially false, a characteristic distortion that relies on privileged knowledge twisted toward malicious ends. If Satan was present at the creation, his understanding of divine intent and cosmic structure would far exceed that of the newly formed humans, giving him a formidable advantage in the contest of wills. The loyal angels, by contrast, use their knowledge in service of the divine plan. They appear throughout Scripture as messengers, delivering revelations to prophets, announcing the births of key figures, and guiding the course of salvation history. The angel Gabriel appears to Daniel, to Zechariah, and to Mary, bearing information about events that will unfold according to the predetermined counsel of God. The angels who minister to Christ in the wilderness and strengthen him in Gethsemane act on the basis of knowledge that transcends the immediate moment, aware of the larger narrative in which these events are embedded. They are witnesses not only to the past, but to the continuity between past and future, agents who remember the beginning and labor toward the consummation. The angelic perspective on creation also invites speculation about what remains hidden from human view. If angels witnessed the laying of the earth's foundations, they also observed elements of the creative process that the Genesis account does not describe. They saw how the firmament was made, whether the waters above are literal or symbolic, what the primordial light was before the sun existed, and whether the formless void of verse 2 resulted from catastrophe or was the neutral starting condition? Their memories constitute an archive of cosmic history, inaccessible to mortals but preserved in the consciousness of beings who do not die and whose existence spans the epochs. The fallen angels possess this archive in corrupted form, while the loyal angels hold it in faithful stewardship, revealing portions of it only when divinely commanded to do so. The question of whether angels remember a pre-Adamic world depends on the interpretive framework one adopts. If the 6 days describe original creation, the angels witnessed only one world, the present one, and their joy at its foundation reflects the celebration of something entirely new. If the gap theory is correct, the angels witnessed 2 worlds, the pristine creation of Genesis 1:1 and the restored creation of the 6 days, with an interval of chaos in between. Their joy at the laying of foundations would then carry a different resonance, not the celebration of novelty, but the relief of renewal, the return of order after a period of ruin. The morning stars would sing not because something unprecedented was happening, but because something lost was being reclaimed. By the close of this chapter, the angels emerge as the only continuous witnesses to the full scope of creation history. They predate humanity, observe the formation of the earth, and carry memories of events that lie beyond the reach of human knowledge. Whether they witnessed one creation or 2, whether they sang at an original foundation or a restored one, their presence establishes that the Genesis account is not the only record of the beginning. There exists another testimony, preserved in the consciousness of beings who stood at the threshold and watched as the world took shape. The loyal angels guard this knowledge, revealing it only in service of the divine purpose. The fallen angels distort it, weaponizing their memories against the very order they once celebrated. Humanity, arriving late to the narrative, inherits a world already witnessed, already contested, already shaped by forces whose origins lie in epochs before Adam drew his first breath. The angels remember, and in their remembering they link the world that was to the world that is, the beginning to the continuation, the foundation to the structure that now rests upon it. The biblical text presents creation with remarkable economy. In 31 verses, Genesis 1 describes the origin of the cosmos, the formation of the earth, the appearance of life, and the creation of humanity. The narrative is structured, deliberate, and spare, offering neither the elaborate genealogies of gods found in ancient mythologies nor the extended philosophical treatises of later metaphysical systems. What it provides is a sequence: light, firmament, land and sea, vegetation, luminaries, creatures of water and sky, beasts of the land, and finally humanity, fashioned in the image of God. The week concludes with rest, and the account moves forward to the garden, the generations of Adam, and the unfolding history of the Hebrew people. At no point does the text pause to explain what, if anything, existed before the 6 days began. At no point does it narrate the creation of angels, the rebellion of Satan, the dissolution of prior worlds, or the interval between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. The silence is absolute. Yet this silence has generated centuries of interpretive activity. The absence of explicit information about pre-Adamic existence has not deterred readers from constructing elaborate frameworks to fill the void. These constructions arise not from direct statements in the text, but from perceived tensions, ambiguities, and details that seem to require explanation. Why does Genesis 1:2 describe the earth as formless and void if Genesis 1:1 declares that God created the heavens and the earth? Why does the phrase tohu wa-bohu appear elsewhere in Scripture only in context of judgment and desolation? Why is light created before the sun? Why does the 2nd day lack the declaration it was good? Why does Isaiah 45:18 insist that God did not create the earth tohu, when Genesis 1:2 uses precisely that term to describe its condition? These questions do not arise from what the text says, but from what it does not say, from the spaces between the verses, the unexplained transitions, the juxtaposition of statements that seem to point in different directions. The hermeneutical methods employed to address these tensions are varied. One approach focuses on keywords, examining the precise Hebrew terms used in the text and tracing their occurrences elsewhere in Scripture. The word bara, to create, is analyzed in contrast to asah, to make, with interpreters arguing that the distinction reveals whether the 6 days describe original creation or the refashioning of existing material. The phrase tohu wa-bohu is compared to its appearances in Isaiah 34:11 and Jeremiah 4:23, both of which describe ruined lands under divine judgment, leading to the inference that Genesis 1:2 also depicts a condition of ruin rather than a neutral starting point. The verb heya, translated, was in, the earth was formless and void, is scrutinized for the possibility that it should be rendered became, implying a transformation from a prior state. Another method involves the comparison of parallel passages. Job 38:7 describes angelic witnesses to the laying of the earth's foundations, prompting the question of when angels were created and what they observed. Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, though addressed to earthly kings, contain language that exceeds human scope, leading interpreters to read them as veiled references to the fall of Satan. Proverbs 8 speaks of wisdom delighting in the sons of men before the earth's foundations were established, raising the possibility of pre-Adamic inhabitants. Isaiah 45:18 declares that God did not create the earth tohu, introducing a theological assertion that appears to contradict the descriptive claim of Genesis 1:2. These passages, scattered across the canon, are assembled into a mosaic, each piece contributing to a larger picture that the Genesis account itself does not draw. A third approach identifies contradictions or tensions within the narrative and seeks to resolve them through supplementary hypotheses. If God is perfect and his works are good, why does the creation account begin with formlessness and darkness? The gap theory resolves this by proposing that the formlessness is not original but subsequent, the result of judgment imposed between verses 1 and 2. If the sun is created on the 4th day, how can there be light on the 1st? The hypothesis of primordial light, whether spiritual radiance, divine presence, or a temporary luminance, explains the sequence by positing a source of illumination independent of celestial bodies. If the waters of the 2nd day are not declared good, does this indicate a problem with the work? The suggestion that the waters are remnants of a prior state, resistant to full ordering, accounts for the omission by treating the 2nd day as provisional rather than complete. These methods share a common feature. They build upon the silence of the text rather than its explicit content. The Genesis account does not say that an interval exists between verses 1 and 2, nor does it describe what occurred during such an interval. It does not name the light of the 1st day or explain why it differs from the luminaries of the 4th. It does not discuss the origins of angels, the timing of Satan's rebellion, or the existence of prior worlds. The frameworks that address these topics are interpretive constructions, inferences drawn from what the text omits, implications extracted from what it hints at but does not state. They are attempts to answer questions that the plain reading of Genesis does not raise, or raises only obliquely, without offering resolution. The legitimacy of these interpretive endeavors has been debated throughout the history of biblical scholarship. Some argue that the silence of the text is a boundary that should not be crossed, that speculation about pre-Adamic history, angelic rebellion, or prior worlds ventures beyond the scope of revelation and into the realm of conjecture. On this view, the Genesis account provides what is necessary for understanding the human condition, the nature of sin, and the need for redemption, and it deliberately refrains from addressing cosmological questions that do not serve those purposes. To construct elaborate theories about events before Adam is to impose modern concerns onto an ancient text, to seek answers to questions the authors never intended to address. Others counter that the silence is not a prohibition, but an invitation. The gaps in the narrative, the unexplained transitions, the juxtaposition of seemingly contradictory statements, all suggest that the text is more complex than it appears, that layers of meaning lie beneath the surface, and that careful reading can uncover truths not immediately visible in the plain sense. The tradition of Midrash, the Jewish practice of searching the scriptures for hidden connections and deeper significance, operates on the premise that every detail matters, that apparent redundancies and ambiguities are deliberate, and that the text rewards sustained interpretive effort. The Kabbalistic frameworks of Shemitot and prior worlds emerge from this tradition, treating the Genesis account not as a complete cosmology, but as a coded summary that conceals as much as it reveals. The question of whether the silence is deliberate or incidental divides interpreters. Some propose that the authors of Genesis possessed knowledge of pre-Adamic history, whether through oral tradition, prophetic insight, or mystical revelation, but chose not to include it in the written account. The opening chapters on this view are condensed summaries, streamlined for theological and liturgical purposes, omitting details that would distract from the central message, that the Creator is sovereign, that the world is His work, and that humanity is made in His image. The silence about prior worlds, angelic rebellion, and the interval between verses 1 and 2 would then be intentional, a decision to focus the narrative on the events most relevant to the covenant relationship between God and Israel. Others argue that the silence reflects the limits of human knowledge. The authors of Genesis recorded what had been revealed to them, but the revelation itself was incomplete. Certain aspects of cosmic history, events in the angelic realm, the mechanics of creation, the existence or non-existence of prior worlds, were not disclosed because they lie beyond the capacity of mortals to comprehend, or because their disclosure would serve no redemptive purpose. The text is silent not because the authors chose to withhold information, but because they did not possess it. What remains unspoken is unknown, and speculation about the unknown, while unavoidable, cannot claim the authority of revelation. A third perspective treats the silence as a rhetorical feature. Ancient Near Eastern creation accounts often begin with chaos, primordial waters, formless void, darkness, before divine action introduces order. The Genesis narrative may adopt this conventional framework, not because it is making a claim about the literal state of the earth before creation, but because it is employing a familiar motif to communicate theological truths, that God is the source of order, that chaos is subject to His command, and that creation is an act of divine will rather than cosmic struggle. The formless void of Genesis 1:2 on this reading is not a historical description but a literary device, a symbolic representation of the absence of structure before the Creator's speech brings differentiation and form. The silence about what preceded the formlessness is not a gap to be filled, but a narrative convention that does not require historical grounding. The interpretive pressure to resolve tensions and explain ambiguities is intensified by the broader theological context in which Genesis is read. For communities that affirm the doctrine of divine perfection, that God is good, omnipotent, and the author of all that is, the formlessness and darkness of Genesis 1:2 pose a problem. If God created the heavens and the earth, and if His works are good, why does the earth appear in a state of disorder? The gap theory addresses this by separating the original creation from the formless condition, attributing the latter to judgment rather than to the Creator's intent. The Kabbalistic frameworks of prior worlds and Shemitot address it by treating the formlessness as a transitional state, the pause between cosmic cycles rather than a flaw in the divine work. Both approaches seek to preserve the goodness of God by locating the source of disorder outside the act of creation itself. Yet the insistence on resolving every tension may itself reflect assumptions foreign to the text. The Genesis account does not engage in systematic theology. It does not define divine attributes, reconcile omnipotence with the existence of chaos, or explain the origin of evil. It narrates, God speaks, and things come to be. Light appears, waters are divided, land emerges, life proliferates. The narrative is concerned with sequence and relationship. What follows what? What is separated from what? What is given dominion over what? The questions that later interpreters bring to the text about the mechanics of creation, the timing of angelic rebellion, the existence of prior worlds, may not be the questions the text is designed to answer. The silence in this view is not a puzzle to be solved, but a boundary marking the limits of what the narrative intends to address. Nonetheless, the history of interpretation demonstrates that silence invites speculation. The human impulse to know, to explain, and to construct coherent frameworks is not easily restrained by textual boundaries. The gaps in the Genesis account have been filled with traditions that span millennia. The midrashic tales of primordial light and hidden worlds, the Kabbalistic doctrines of Sefirot and cosmic cycles, the Christian readings of Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 as references to Satan's fall, the gap theory's proposal of an interval between Genesis 1 and 1:2. None of these traditions claim to be grounded in explicit biblical statement. All acknowledge to varying degrees that they are interpretive constructions, frameworks built upon inference, implication, and the juxtaposition of scattered passages. Yet they persist because they address questions that the plain text raises but does not answer, or because they resolve tensions that readers perceive even if the text itself does not acknowledge them. The acknowledgement that these frameworks are constructions does not necessarily diminish their value. Interpretation is always a constructive act, a process of bringing coherence to elements that the text presents without fully integrating. Even the most literal reading involves choices about how to understand vocabulary, how to relate one passage to another, and how to apply ancient narrative to contemporary contexts. The question is not whether interpretation constructs meaning, but whether the construction is faithful to the text, internally coherent, and theologically sound. The gap theory, the doctrine of Shemitot, and the mystical readings of primordial light are all constructions, but they are constructions that engage seriously with the details of the Genesis account, that attempt to honor the integrity of the text while addressing the questions it seems to provoke. The silence of the record, then, is both a limitation and a generative space. It limits what can be known with certainty about pre-Adamic history, the timing of angelic creation, and the events that may have preceded the 6 days. It forbids the interpreter from claiming divine authority for speculative frameworks that lack explicit textual support. Yet it also generates the very interpretive traditions it does not explicitly authorize, creating a space in which readers can explore possibilities, test hypotheses, and construct cosmologies that fill the gaps. The silence is not empty. It is populated by centuries of commentary, midrash, mystical insight, and theological reflection, traditions that do not replace the text but surround it, interpreting its ambiguities and extending its implications in directions the plain reading does not pursue. By the close of this chapter, the silence of the Genesis account stands as both evidence and enigma. It is evidence that the text does not provide an explicit account of pre-Adamic history, angelic rebellion, or prior worlds. What exists are hints, ambiguities, and tensions that interpreters have spent millennia attempting to resolve. It is an enigma because the silence itself invites interpretation. The absence of information becomes a canvas upon which traditions are painted, each attempting to fill the void with frameworks drawn from scattered verses, inferred meanings, and theological necessity. The gap theory, the Shemitot, the hidden light, the fall of Satan, all are constructions built upon what the text does not say, yet all claim to illuminate what the text implies. Whether the silence is deliberate or incidental, whether it marks a boundary or an invitation, it remains the foundation upon which speculation rests. The record is silent, and in its silence it speaks, not with the clarity of explicit statement, but with the resonance of questions unanswered, transitions unexplained, and mysteries preserved across the ages. The sixth day arrives with the earth already transformed. Light has been established, dividing day from night in regular rhythm. The firmament separates the waters, creating habitable space between the chaos above and the chaos below. The land has emerged from the seas, bearing vegetation that seeds and reproduces according to its kind. The sun, moon, and stars govern the heavens, marking seasons and years. The waters teem with fish and the skies with birds. The land is populated with livestock, creeping things, and beasts of the field. The stage is prepared, the conditions are set, and into this ordered world humanity is introduced. Genesis 1:26 records a deliberation. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." The plural form, "let us make," has been interpreted variously as a royal plural, a consultation with the angelic hosts, or a reflection of the triune nature of God. What is clear is that the creation of humanity is distinct from the preceding acts. Unlike the other creatures, which are brought forth from the waters and the land, humanity is made in the divine image, granted dominion over the rest of creation, and addressed directly by the Creator. The distinction is not merely functional but ontological. Humans bear the imago Dei, a status that sets them apart from the animals and establishes their role as stewards and representatives of divine authority on earth. Genesis 2 provides a second account, narrowing the focus to the formation of the first man. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. The verb translated formed is yatsar, evoking the work of a potter shaping clay, a hands-on, intimate act of craftsmanship. Adam is not spoken into existence as the light and the luminaries were, nor is he brought forth from the earth by divine command as the animals were. He is shaped, molded, fashioned from the Adamah, the dust or soil of the ground. The wordplay is deliberate. Adam, man, is formed from Adamah, ground, linking humanity to the earth from which it is taken and to which it will return. The dust from which Adam is formed is material already present. It is not created in the moment of his fashioning, but exists as part of the created order, shaped and ordered during the preceding days. The soil is the fertile, arable layer of the earth, the substance capable of bearing life, not the rock or metal of the deeper strata, but the light, shifting particles of the surface. This detail carries theological weight. Adam's body is composed of the same matter as the rest of creation, subject to the same physical laws, vulnerable to decay and dissolution. The breath of life, breathed directly into his nostrils by God, is what animates the dust, transforming inert matter into a living soul. Without the divine breath, Adam is dust. With it, he becomes a being capable of thought, relationship, and moral agency. The act of formation from dust suggests continuity with the material creation of the 6 days. If the gap theory is correct, the dust itself may be a remnant of the prior world, the residue of a creation that was dissolved and then reconstituted. The formless earth of Genesis 1:2, covered by waters and shrouded in darkness, contained within it the substance that would later be shaped into land, vegetation, animals, and finally humanity. The dust from which Adam is formed would then carry within it the history of the cosmos, the memory of the pristine creation of Genesis 1:1, the catastrophe that reduced it to chaos, and the six-day restoration that prepared it for habitation once more. Adam, shaped from this dust, becomes the heir of all that preceded him, inheriting a world shaped by forgotten rises and falls, cycles of creation and dissolution that the text does not narrate, but that the mystical traditions propose. If the Kabbalistic frameworks of Shemitot and prior worlds are correct, Adam is not the first human to exist, but the first human of the current cycle. His soul, according to Lurianic teaching, contains within it the root souls of all humanity, 600,000 sparks that will eventually incarnate across the generations. But some traditions suggest that his soul also contains fragments from the prior worlds, remnants of beings who lived and perished in epochs before the present order began. These sparks carry memories encoded in their structure, traces of existence in realms governed by different divine names and different laws of nature. Adam's creation, then, is not the absolute beginning of human consciousness, but a new beginning, the formation of a being who inherits the legacy of what came before, and whose descendants will carry that legacy forward into the future. The Garden of Eden, where Adam is placed after his formation, is described in Genesis 2:8-15 as a specific location within the larger created world. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. The garden is not the entirety of creation, but a designated space within it, a paradise prepared for humanity's dwelling. 4 rivers flow from Eden: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates, suggesting a geographical setting, though the exact location has been debated for centuries. Proposals range from northern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates originate, to southern Mesopotamia near the Persian Gulf, to regions in Armenia or the broader Fertile Crescent. What is clear is that Eden is a place, not a symbol, and that it exists within a world that extends beyond its boundaries. The placement of Adam in a garden within the larger world raises the question of what exists beyond Eden's borders. If the garden is a specific location, what occupies the rest of the earth? The text does not describe other inhabitants, but it does not preclude them. When Cain is expelled from the presence of God after murdering Abel, he expresses fear of being killed by others, and he goes on to build a city and take a wife whose origin is never explained. The narrative assumes a broader human context, though it does not account for its origins within the Adamic line. Some interpreters have proposed that other people existed alongside Adam and Eve, descendants of a pre-Adamic creation, living beyond the borders of Eden in regions the text does not address. Others argue that the city and the wife belong to later descendants of Adam, whose births are summarized briefly and whose numbers grew rapidly in the early generations. The threshold between the hidden and the visible passes through Adam. Before his formation, the narrative is cosmic: light and darkness, waters and firmament, land and sea, celestial bodies and living creatures. These are universal realities, the structure of the world itself. With Adam, the focus narrows. The narrative becomes personal, relational, genealogical. Adam names the animals, walks with God in the garden, receives commands, and exercises moral choice. The genealogies that follow, from Adam to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, from Abraham to David, trace a single line of descent, a thread that runs through the generations and culminates in the people of Israel and, in Christian reading, in the Messiah. The world before Adam, if it existed, is not part of this line. It is prehistory in the truest sense, before the history that the text chooses to record. The creation of Adam also marks the beginning of moral agency within the human sphere. The command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil introduces the possibility of disobedience, the capacity to choose against divine will. The animals, created on the fifth and sixth days, are not given commands. They operate according to instinct and nature, fulfilling the purposes for which they were made without the burden or dignity of choice. Adam, made in the image of God, possesses the freedom to obey or rebel, and with that freedom comes responsibility and consequence. The fall that follows in Genesis 3 is not the first fall in the cosmic order. If the gap theory and the tradition of angelic rebellion are correct, Satan fell long before Adam. But it is the first fall of humanity, the event that introduces sin into the Adamic line and sets the stage for the need for redemption. The theological significance of Adam extends beyond his role as the first man of the present order. In 1 Corinthians 15:45, Paul calls him the first man and contrasts him with Christ, the last Adam. The parallel suggests that Adam is not merely the biological progenitor of humanity, but the representative figure, the one whose actions have consequences for all who descend from him. His obedience or disobedience shapes the condition of the race. If pre-Adamic beings existed, they are not part of this representative structure. Adam's unique status lies in his role as the head of the covenant line, the figure through whom sin enters the world and through whom, in the reversal accomplished by Christ, redemption is offered. The positioning of Eden as a threshold also reshapes the understanding of the creation week. If the 6 days describe the preparation of the world for Adam, then everything that precedes his formation serves a teleological purpose. It moves toward his arrival and the inauguration of the human task of dominion and stewardship. The light, the firmament, the seas and land, the vegetation, the luminaries, the creatures of water, sky, and earth, all are elements of the stage upon which Adam will act. The formless void of Genesis 1, 2, the primordial light of day 1, the divided waters of day 2, the light before the sun, all become part of the background, the scaffolding that supports the human narrative but is not the focus of it. The text does not elaborate on these elements because they are not the point. The point is Adam, and through Adam, the covenant relationship between God and humanity. Yet the presence of Adam on a stage prepared by 6 days of labor invites reflection on what the stage itself represents. If the world into which Adam is placed is a restored order, a renewed creation built upon the ruins of what came before, then Adam inherits not a pristine beginning but a second chance. The garden is Eden, but the world beyond the garden bears the marks of history, the formless void that was ordered, the darkness that was pierced by light, the waters that were divided and contained. The dust from which Adam is formed may carry within it the memory of prior epochs, the residue of worlds that were created, dissolved, and absorbed into the foundation of the present order. Adam's task is not to create but to tend, not to initiate but to sustain, not to pioneer but to inherit and steward what has been prepared for him. The threshold of Adam is also a boundary of knowledge. Beyond this point, the narrative is clear. The genealogies are recorded, the events are narrated, the history unfolds in a linear sequence that can be traced and verified within the scope of the text. Before this point, the narrative is silent. The questions raised in the preceding chapters, the timing of angelic creation, the nature of the primordial light, the existence of prior worlds, the fall of Satan, the meaning of the formless void, remain unanswered by explicit statement. Adam stands at the juncture between the known and the unknown, the recorded and the inferred, the chronicle and the mystery. By the close of this chapter, the threshold of Adam emerges as the pivotal moment where cosmic speculation gives way to human history. Whether the world he inherits is the first creation or the latest in a series of cycles, whether the dust from which he is formed contains the memory of prior orders, or is neutral matter called into being on the third day, whether the garden is the absolute beginning or a threshold within a longer sequence, these questions remain open. What is certain is that with Adam, the narrative shifts. The focus narrows from the universal to the particular, from the structure of the cosmos to the choices of individuals, from the acts of God alone to the interaction between creator and creature. The line of descent begins, the genealogies commence, and the story that will lead through Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and ultimately to the redemption accomplished in Christ is set in motion. Adam is the heir of all that preceded him, whether that inheritance includes only the 6 days or encompasses the hidden epochs that the mystical traditions propose. He is formed from dust, animated by divine breath, placed in a garden within a world that extends beyond his immediate dwelling. He is given dominion, commanded to steward, and granted the freedom to choose. His creation marks the end of one sequence and the beginning of another, the end of cosmic preparation and the beginning of human agency, the end of the hidden and the beginning of the revealed, the end of mystery and the beginning of chronicle. The cycles of creation, if they occurred, converge in him. The worlds that were and were not, the light before the sun, the waters above and below, the angels who sang at the foundations, all find their purpose in the formation of the one made in the image of God, placed at the threshold where the forgotten gives way to the remembered, and the silent record yields to the spoken word.